Welcome back, everybody. I see I didn't scare too many people off. Alright, so I'm trying to think of any housekeeping. I can't really think of much. I got some feedback last week. I appreciate that. The main points I got were that I fidget and that I talk too fast. So I tried to reduce the number of slides and better prepare. Like I said last week, this is new to me, so I'm kind of feeling it out, and I'm just hoping everybody will be patient with me while we're doing it. Alright, so like I promised last week, I gave out some questions. And for those of you who weren't here last week, they're in the foyer on the big table if you want to get that one, or get that handout and look at them. But I said we'd go over them if anybody had gone back and answered them and wanted to talk about it. So, if y'all want to, we can go ahead. I used to not have the clicker. Okay, here we go. Alright, so first question. 1 Peter 3:15 is not the only verse that uses the word apologia. Remember we talked about apologia last week, Greek word meaning to give a defense, essentially. So using a concordance or the internet, whatever resource you'd like, find another verse where that word is used. So did anybody go and do that? Did you find any other verses that used apologia? Anyone? A couple people. Okay. Anybody want to just yell one out?
Acts 25:16.
Okay. You want to read that for me, please?
Sure.
Great.
Can I read a couple of verses in context?
Yeah, if you want to, that's fine.
So this is when Paul is in prison or in custody. Starting at verse 13, it says, "When some days had passed, Agrippa the king, Bernice, arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, 'There's a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him.'"
Okay. So do you remember where apologia, like what words or what translation it was in there?
Well, I looked up
Okay.
a verse that had one and it said this one. I assumed it was the word defense.
I
but didn't
expect
see
it's
the
either
word for word.
defense or make his case. It said make his case a couple times. Anyone else have a different one? Kayla, what'd you have?
Philippians 1:16.
Okay. Do you want to read that?
Yeah.
Okay.
The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel.
Okay. Defense. That one's pretty obvious. All right. So, keeping in mind this and what we talked about last week, what does apologia mean in these verses? So, Paul's before Agrippa, and they're giving an apologia. So, what's going on?
They're defending Darius?
Yeah, they're defending. Paul's defending himself. They're giving a defense. And so it's actually a very good literal usage of what's going on because he's kind of on trial, right? In a way, he's giving a defense. Okay, what about the other verse, the Philippians verse? How are we using apologia there? What does it mean?
Defending the gospel.
Okay, so in that case, apologia is not really being used as much in the literal sense, but it's being used in the sense we kind of talked about last week, where he is presenting his reasons and his evidence for the gospel. He's making a defense, he's making a case, he's presenting his case for the gospel. So, apologia, it's got a pretty uniform meaning as far as we're concerned in the scripture. So, how do these verses and the usage here relate to what we talked about last week about apologetics? The last question we talked. Well, we brought up a verse in Acts about Paul before Agrippa, and we talked about Philippians 1:6, I think, defending the gospel.
All the ones I saw were defined as defense, except for 2 Corinthians 7:11, which was defined as vindication.
Okay. Which is kind of comes after the defense, or as a result of the defense. Okay.
Helping you defend your belief and helping to explain others, hopefully lead others.
Mm-hmm.
apologetics, and that's really what used to define the apologetics, is what it's all based on.
Okay.
Where the defense comes from.
A system of ways to defend.
Yeah, so this is a point I want to bring out, and I want to make sure that you guys understand. Some of you, most of you maybe might know it already, but I want to make sure to make this point. Apologetics does not describe a small group of certain topics that you might study. Apologetics is a mindset. It's an approach. Whether it's standing in front of a governor explaining why you're a Christian, or it's just talking to people in everyday life and explaining why you believe in God, apologetics is an approach that you take as part of your Christianity, because it's how you interact with people and it's how you answer people. Apologetics is not just about evolution or the universe or whatever issue might be popular or might be prevalent in what you're dealing with. Apologetics is an approach to how you spread the gospel. That's not the only approach, and I think as we talked about last week, it's not sufficient by itself necessarily to convert anyone out there, but it's a tool. It's part of your toolbox. So I guess my point is to make sure not to limit yourself in how you look at it. Okay, anything else on that one? Going once, going twice? All right, so second question. Why do you think some Christians today avoid the study of apologetics? What reasons would you give to encourage them to study apologetics? Anybody?
Maybe it sounds too PhD-ish.
Okay. What were you going to say?
And people are scared to offend
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times.
Okay.
I'm gonna let you believe what you believe, and I'm gonna believe what I believe, and because they may know more than I do. You know what I mean?
Right. Okay, so yeah, there's two parts here, and I want to address both of them. First of all, and that's a reason that I didn't use the word apologetics too much before this class started, is it does kind of scare some people off because they think, well, I don't have a scientific background, or I don't, sit down and study these things in depth all the time, so this isn't really for me. This is more for those intellectuals who want to get together in a think tank and talk about their arguments. And I want to say that's a misconception. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be that way, and there are aspects of it that are, but it doesn't have to be that way. As I said a minute ago, it's a mindset. It's an approach. It doesn't have to be lofty and intellectual. It's just how you're talking to people and how you're defending things. We don't want to get in the mindset that apologetics is what 4 or 5 men do in Montgomery and show us their website and present to us every now and then. It's something that we can all be doing in some way. And then the other point is that apologetics involves a little bit of, for lack of a better word, risk. You're putting yourself out there. You're talking to somebody. It's not that you can just be passive and enjoy your religion by yourself. There are people out there who have questions, and it's our responsibility to go and answer those questions and help those people out. And it's scary. I mean, we can all admit that. It's not, I don't think it's a shame to talk about that. And part of the reason for having this class is I want to help with that, with anybody who might be experiencing it, is to give more confidence. And like I mentioned last week, I don't know is an okay answer as long as you're going to follow up later with that person. You can say, okay, I need to think about that. That's a good point. Let me go see. So dealing with that fear, not just in apologetics, but in Christianity in general, in evangelism as a whole, is something that we all have to face and we all have to learn to deal with. But we're capable of it. We can do it. A lot of times I think we get afraid because we're expecting it all to be on us, and we're by ourselves doing this. But that's not what the Bible teaches. God gives the increase. We're just throwing out the seeds. Anything else?
I think there's kind of a feeling that, not from everybody, but I think from a lot of people that apologetics aren't really important. That's a neat thing to learn that you can use if you want to. It's not really a big deal. It's kind of like really learning a lot about the minor prophets, or really learning a lot about some other part of scripture or gospel that we think of as being more obscure. And so a lot of people are like, well, I study the New Testament, or I really like to study about Jesus, or I really like to learn about, grace and share about grace with people. And not that those topics are any less important, but I think apologetics can be important too, and maybe people don't always see it that way. It's more like an ancillary thing that you can learn if you want to.
Well, not only that, you can apply those concepts to whatever you're studying. You know, like I said a minute ago, it's not something off on its own. It's a way that you approach everything else that you're studying. For example, I was talking to the 7th to 10th grade class this past Sunday when we were going through Genesis. We're starting off going through Genesis. And the point was a textual survey. We were reading through and talking about the first 11 chapters. But as part of that, we talked about the creation. All right, popular apologetics topic. It wasn't an apologetics class, but that's a point that I could bring out as I was teaching Genesis. All right, last one is a long one. And it might have been a little lofty, I hope not, but we'll see. We'll talk about it. While speaking to the crowd in Athens in Acts 17:28, Paul quotes Epimenides and Aratus, two Greek, therefore pagan, philosophers. Why would Paul quote pagans while presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ? How could you use this approach when speaking to a non-Christian today? An example I gave was a Muslim, but you know, you could apply this to any religious group. Any thoughts?
To meet them on their level, be where they are spiritually.
Okay, yeah.
You do something that they're familiar with, so you begin to build a camaraderie with them.
Okay. Yeah, so the answer I'm hearing, and that's what I was thinking too, is Paul did not start in the old law like he did in other places. He didn't start with Old Testament prophecies. He didn't start teaching out of Isaiah. Because these were Greeks. They were pagans. They didn't know the old law. They didn't read Isaiah. That meant nothing to them at the time because that's not where they were. So what Paul did is he started where they were and in their own belief system, in their own philosophy, and showed evidence for God. Does that make sense? So like kind of last week when I mentioned know your audience, this is part of that. Know where they're coming from. You can start there and build off of what you have in common and lead them, hopefully, to where they need to be. So how would you use this with someone who's not a Christian today? Any like specific examples?
Well, I mean, if you have a little bit of information regarding the Quran, then you can use that when you talk to someone who's Muslim. The idea the Quran does not agree with Christ being deity, but it refers to him as a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And it also says that any true prophet of God cannot lie.
Mm-hmm.
So now you can take that and say, okay, let's go over to the Bible and the words of what Jesus says. And Jesus says, I am the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. So is Jesus truly a prophet?
Mm-hmm.
If the answer is yes, then what he says has to be true. So no one can come to the Father except by me. But you start out with something that they're familiar with.
Yeah, so it's not a sin to read the Quran. It's not a sin to read the Talmud. It's not a sin to read the Bhagavad Gita, which is Hindu. You can use what their belief system is and find those bridges and start building them. Maybe you can start with something that Muhammad said in the Quran and say, okay, you know, Muhammad even says that Abraham was a man of God or something. You can start back where they find a common religious ancestor with us and Abraham. Or, you know, whatever it may be. If you're talking to a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness, going back to the Bible and using, because they accept the Bible, that if the Bible's exclusive, then you can use what they believe in to start building your case. So this is kind of the point of this question, is to get you thinking about, when you approach someone who's not a Christian, keep in mind what they do believe, because you can usually use that to help your case and start at that point.
You know, you look at the Quran, it has various things in there that you can use, but it's one confusing book.
It is. I'm not going to defend the validity of
I've
it.
never been able to make any sense out of it.
It shows a very, very serious lack of understanding of God.
Yeah. But you can usually find at least some shreds of truth in most religions out there. And you can use that shred of truth to start building and showing the whole truth.
And someone's gonna listen to you better with that kind of approach than starting off with an argument that gives the idea, oh, you're not with us, well here, It's so great that you're here and I can share the truth with you.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah.
And that-
And we're not talking about watering down our message. What we're talking about is changing the manner in which we present it. I'm not watering down anything I say. I'm just saying it in a different way that makes it easier for them to get on board.
Not Paul said, he said, I'm all things to all people. In other
Exactly.
words, what he's trying to say is I'm getting on their level to lead them to Christ.
Right. To the Greeks, I'm a Greek. To the Jews, I'm a Jew. To the barbarians, whatever it is, that's how I'm going to approach them, because that's the best way to reach them. All right. Anything else? All right. So let's make it easier on me because we just killed 15 minutes. Okay. So week 2. I've kind of amended this a little bit since I gave out the handout, but hopefully it'll be useful to you. Tools of the trade. So some things that we can be using when we're trying to practice the things we're talking about. You're going to be seeing some of these ideas in the coming weeks. And I'm going to try to implement them into what I present so that we can kind of build our thought processes a little bit. Mostly tonight I'm going to talk about logic. I'm going to talk about evidence a little bit, but the title of this class, or part of the title of this class, is Faith and Reason. So I want to go over the reason part and build a good background for that before we get into actually dealing with specific topics. My slide is not changing over here, so it's really messing me up. All right, so part of 1 Peter 3:15 is that you're supposed to give a reason for the hope that is in you, right? A reason. So we're going to go back to the Greek a little bit. Again, Greek word there for reason is logos, which is lambda, omega, gamma, omega, sigma. Why is this already dried out? Oh, it's because it's not mine. Try it again. Logos. All right. So what logos means, according to Strong's, is reasoning expressed by words, or the expression of a thought. So the idea is that there's something going on up here that's coming out here. That's pretty much all there is to logos. You're presenting a reason. Interesting though. Oh my, hold on. Alright. Does that sound familiar to any of you? It's the basis of the word logic. Logos, L-O-G. Logic comes from logos. So, what's interesting, what I was going to say a minute ago, is it traces back to the very beginning. Someone read, not 1 John, that should be John. Someone read John 1:1 for me, please.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
All right. So if I had a concordance handy, I'd have somebody to do it for me. But in the beginning was the Word. If you look in the Greek, it was in the beginning was the logos. The word there is logos. It's the same Greek word. So Jesus is referred to as the capital L logos. Little O over here is the basically in the Greek. So instead of a logos, it's the logos. Jesus is the reason. So it says here with Strong's, when used of Christ, it means that he's expressing the thoughts of God through the Spirit. And that makes sense, right? Jesus came to earth to give us God's word. He expressed God's word. So Christ is the expression of God's thoughts to us. It's like God is speaking his thoughts through Christ. So what we can draw from that is God is logical. Logic comes from God. So, it might be a little abstract to talk about sometimes, but it's not an unscriptural idea. And it's not that we're applying something of our own to God. It's how we describe it. But it's not that I'm saying that logic came before God. It's just that logic is part of God's being. God is, God is a spirit, but he is also a mind as part of that. He has thoughts. He says, my thoughts are above your thoughts. And one of the prophets, he says, come let us reason together. So reason and logic is an attribute of God. And therefore, since we're made in God's image, it is also part of us. You think about it. Logic is what keeps you from killing yourself every day. You take it for granted, but you stop at a red light. Why? That light is red. If I go into this intersection, I might get hit. Therefore, I am not going to do that. I'm going to stay here. It's logic. We take it for granted because we use it so much. But it's how we think. And that helps us because we're presenting to people our reasons for believing. Now, question, is it bad to argue?
No.
It's not wrong to argue.
Being arguing with me or not?
See, what we want to do as Christians is we want to argue,
In love.
right, if you want to keep it catchy, argue without being argumentative. That make sense? Apologetics, defense without being defensive, arguing without being argumentative. We use love and our compassion to temper what we're saying, but you know, in the strictest definition, we're using logical arguments often because we're using reason. So, a common example, kind of to give us a baseline, used in logic, is a very simple logical statement that traces back to Greece. And it's simply this. Socrates is a man. Okay, Socrates, old Greek philosopher. Socrates is a man. Man is mortal. We can accept that, aside from a few special exceptions we read about in the Bible. Eventually, man dies. I need to use my math symbols. Oops. So based on these two statements, we come to the conclusion that Socrates, the man, is mortal. Now that's pretty intuitive. You could say that very easily, that Socrates is mortal, he's dead. We know that he was mortal. But this is kind of the baseline of how we're approaching logical thinking. I can make these statements. As long as the statements are true, whatever follows has to be true. If I can defend these statements, then my conclusion works. So, basically a logical argument is made up of two parts. You have the premise or the premises or whatever, basically your statements, and then you have your conclusion, your therefore. Premise, 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 therefore conclusion. That's how it works. I'm going to make these statements, and provided they're true and they work together, I have a valid conclusion that you can't argue with unless you disprove one of the statements I made earlier. Important is that logic does not involve emotions. It does not matter how angry or sad or happy or whatever I am when I write these things. The truth is not affected by that. The truth is just affected by the facts. And that'll be more important in a few minutes. But this is how we give our logos to people. When you think about it, whenever you're giving a reason for anything you do, you're going through this process. It may not be this simply laid out, but it's the process that your mind is going through when you're thinking about your reasons for what you do. So there's two types of reasoning, two main types of reasoning. There's deductive reasoning, and there's inductive reasoning. You think about deductive reasoning a lot of times when you think about a detective. And that may or may not be the case depending on what he's doing. But the idea of a deductive argument or deductive reasoning is I'm going to lay out the statements, and whatever I deduce, whatever I come up with, follows from the statements I gave. This is a deductive reasoning argument because these are laid out, and this follows just by reading the statements. And it has to be true. There's no way it can't be true if the statements are true. So the difference between deductive and inductive is deductive, it means if everything else is true, the conclusion has to be true.
Like a computer program.
Yeah, I mean there's no qualifiers, there's no maybes or ifs or anything like that. It's definitely true if everything else supporting it is true. If you're building a house and all the walls are sturdy, then the house is going to stand. Now, inductive is what we see a lot in science, in history, and all those studies of things that we can't directly observe. So, chemistry, archaeology, paleontology, a lot of those involve inductive reasoning, because what you're doing is you're having to piece together pieces of information. I wasn't around when that dinosaur died. I don't know what killed it. However, there's a bunch of tar around him, so I figured that he's probably died in a tar pit. That's the idea of inductive reasoning, is I don't know, but the evidence surrounding what I'm talking about leads me to this conclusion. So if the premise is true, then the conclusion is probably true. I can't say with certainty, otherwise it would be a deductive argument. So inductive, you talk about intuition, right? It's telling you a certain way, which you don't know for sure. So inductive reasoning means it's probably true. This is important when we're dealing with evidences for God, and also when you're dealing with people who are talking about, what this historian said or what the scientist said, to keep this in mind. Okay, so I want to talk about a few issues that you might run into dealing with logic. Anyone heard of the word fallacy? You know what a fallacy is? I know you took logic in college. You know all this already. What's a fallacy?
A mistake.
Okay, it's a mistake. It's something incorrect. So in logic, when you're talking about logic, if you actually kind of study it, there are names for certain fallacies, certain incorrect arguments that people can make. Now, the reason I'm presenting this to you is because you need to know about these, because you can spot them when you're talking to somebody. And also, you need to avoid them when you're talking to somebody, because you don't want to be right for the wrong reason. That's not good enough for us. Right? We're Christians. We're following God. We want to be right for the right reasons. So you want to avoid these fallacies, but you also want to be able to spot them when they're being used against you, because it's going to save you a whole lot of trouble. And there are a whole lot more than what I'm showing you guys, but seeing as how far I went over last week, I just wanted to give you 3. But there are several. First is the straw man. Anyone heard of the straw man before? So think back to the Wizard of Oz, right? You had... That's the best I got. The Scarecrow. What was a defining trait of the Scarecrow, other than brains? I'm not talking about brains. If you watched the Scarecrow walking down the yellow brick road, what did you notice?
It was wobbly.
He was wobbly. Flimsy. He couldn't stand up on his own. That's the idea behind the straw man. The straw man argument is an argument that can't stand on its own, but it's easy to prop up. So the idea is that someone, if you make a logical statement against somebody, you make an argument, you present your case, what they do is they turn around and they'll misquote your argument or your conclusion. Or they'll say something that sounds similar but isn't what you said, and then they provide their supporting evidence or argument, and they say, ha, you're wrong because of this. Here's an example. Well, example in a minute, sorry. I'm going through all of them first, then I'll give you examples. The second one I want to present is the argument ad hominem, which is Latin, it just means against the man. What argument ad hominem refers to is attacking someone's character, or attacking someone's morality, or whatever it may be. The problem with that is you're not attacking the argument. You're not dealing with the argument you've been presented. You're attacking the messenger. That doesn't actually deal with the argument that's been presented. You're not defending anything. You're diverting. You're trying to attack the person instead of the argument. And the third one I want to talk about is the appeal to pity. And this one is very strong and works really well in politics. Basically what it is if you stir up people's emotions, then they might listen to what you're saying in spite of their reasoning or their logic. So it uses emotion to convince people of what it wants instead of actually convincing them mentally through their mind.
Kind of like the denominational world.
Yeah, I mean, you do see some of that, definitely. You're appealing to someone's emotions instead of showing them in the scriptures what's the truth. So here are a few examples I want to share with you guys. How are we doing on time? We're doing okay. So an example of a straw man. the first cause argument. You might have heard this talking about apologetics before. The idea is that the universe needs a cause. And so what we say is that cause is God. So then the atheist turns back around and says, well, what's God's cause? That's a straw man. Anybody have an idea why it's a straw man?
Because there's,
What'd you say?
God doesn't need a cause.
Okay.
well, that's what I was gonna say, I mean, you can make the argument
Okay.
that God might have many causes.
Okay.
Doesn't present any evidence.
Okay.
I guess the first premise is false.
God's outside of the physical world.
Okay. All these are valid, and they're all kind of saying what I'm trying to get to, but I want to lay it out in a more simple way just so we can make sure that we know why we're saying what we're saying. Because what you're saying is right, but this is why it's right. Remember the straw man. It takes your argument and turns it into something else, something weaker that they can disprove. So this is what they think your argument is, and this is what they're presenting back to you. The problem is, we're not claiming that everything that exists has a cause. I will never tell someone that everything that exists must have a cause. What I say is everything that has a beginning must have a cause. You see the difference here? But God, by definition, does not have a beginning. Therefore, this argument doesn't apply. So, like I was saying, this is a misquotation of the argument we try to make. And be careful to not say this yourself, because you're not saying that everything that exists has a cause. You're saying everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe, human life, whatever it may be. Anything within the physical world that has a beginning must have a cause behind it. Since God is not in the physical world, and God did not begin to exist, but has always existed by definition, this is a straw man argument and is not valid. Does that make sense? Okay, so what's the problem? It doesn't address the actual argument. It rephrases it to make it seem more than what it is. There we go. Okay, so an ad hominem example. These are pretty easy to come up with, but the hypocrite argument. You've heard this one before, I'm sure. What people say is Christians are hypocrites, therefore Christianity can't be true, therefore I don't need to be a Christian, and you've got an atheist, or you've got someone who's bitter with religion. What's the problem here? Other than maybe their heart or their approach.
Christianity's truth isn't predicated upon the perfection of its followers.
Exactly. Even if no one believed in God, he would still exist. It doesn't matter the character of anyone who's saying something about God. That doesn't affect the truth. A great person could...
But also making the fallacy of making their salvation dependent on what somebody else is doing.
True, yeah. That you're placing your fate in someone else's hands, which you never want to do in any situation. Unless those hands are Jesus, or God's. You don't want to do that. So, the problem is that people have no bearing on what's true and what's not. And we'll talk about this later on when we talk about objective morality. It's one of the last topics we'll cover week 12 or 13, I think. But, the basic idea is, no matter what I do in my life, that doesn't affect what's true or false. Truth is going to go on without me. So a good example. You take Hitler and you take Gandhi. They both say the sky is blue. Is Hitler wrong because he's a bad person? No, the sky is still blue.
I feel like I see that one on social media a lot. Like a disagreement or a discussion will start about something religious, and the individual is kind of like, well, you're not perfect either. Well, have you ever told a lie before?
Yeah.
And that they use that to kind of end the argument. Like, you can't possibly try to teach me about God since you do bad things.
Since you are not perfect, yeah. And I mean, as one of the questions on the this week's assignment shows, Jesus put up with that. I think I might have spoiled that question. Forget I said that. Okay, the appeal to pity. Someone read Luke 9:59, please.
Then he said to his mother, "Follow me." Then he said, "Lord," but he said, "Lord, let me go. Let me first go and bury my father."
Okay, so the story here is, this guy wanted to follow Jesus, but he said, but let me bury my father first. So, how is he approaching what he's saying to Christ?
Well, he's saying, I'll follow you, but I got something more important to do.
Okay. So he's trying to draw on Christ's compassion to have pity on what he's talking about. Now, the issue is that emotion, just like people's actions, has no bearing on truth. Like I said earlier, when someone makes an argument against you and you answer it, and they don't respond back with an actual debate or anything, they say, well, what's a good example? I'm sorry, I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Is it like when people say, well, how could a loving God allow bad things to happen to people? Like, is that an appeal opinion?
Yeah, I would.
Or the little children.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possible one, yeah, because instead of looking at it logically, they're using children or something to spark an emotion in you and try to convert you to their thought process. So again, they're not using logic, they're not building up an argument, they're trying to appeal to your emotions.
We see that a lot with the homosexual.
That's true, yeah, that's a good point.
And we see today is God loves me.
Yeah, so if you're talking
That
about
can't be wrong.
homosexuality being a sin, someone's going to be like, well, God is love, or, well, this or that. And it's not actually going to the scripture and trying to find an argument for it. It's, well, emotion, therefore it can't be true. So that's a good one. I like that example. All right. So here are a few tips that I want to give for when you're giving an argument in defense of God or in defense of the Bible or whatever it may be. Some tips to be effective and I'm giving you some things to watch out for. Here are some tips to actually do it better, I guess, to present things in a better way. And the first one, I don't have the tactics book with me, but I showed it last week. One of the things that the guy in there talks about is to stay in control of the conversation. And by that, I don't mean to dominate the conversation. What I mean is you need to make sure that the conversation is flowing in a constructive way. You don't need to let the person you're talking to start chasing rabbit holes. You need to keep them on topic, and you need to be able to present what you're talking about and keep it constructive. So you want to do that. The best way to do that is to ask questions, because you're controlling the topics that are being brought up because you're asking them, what do you think? The second point is ask the person you're talking to for explanations for why they believe what they believe. Make them defend some of their beliefs for a change. Now, obviously, we want to defend our beliefs too. But when you have a person who's actually having to explain why they believe what they believe, a lot of times that person has to think, and they haven't done that before with those beliefs they have. And once they start thinking, the gears start turning, and a lot of times they might start realizing, well, that doesn't really actually make as much sense as I thought it did. So don't only ask, what do you believe, but ask, why do you believe it? Why did you come to this conclusion? What are your reasons? And we talked about earlier, what are your reasons for believing this? And when someone has to defend themselves, they're either going to learn a lot about what they believe, or they're going to start seeing some things they didn't see before. And third point is to avoid red herrings. Anyone know what a red herring is?
It's a common tactic to change subjects.
Oh, hush.
Something outrageous thrown out there to distract.
Okay. Yeah, it's a distraction tactic. I've been told that the origin of the red herring is that they used to actually, when they were training dogs, they would have red herrings fish outside, and they would try to lead the dog off the path. And so you would train the dog to follow the scent or whatever instead of following the red herrings, and that's where it comes from. You will see this on Facebook all the time. Because if someone says something religious and you give them an answer, they're not going to respond to your answer, they're going to change the subject. Because when you give your answer and they don't know what to say, all they can do is say something different. You'll see it in real life too. I'm not saying it won't happen in real life, but I see this on Facebook so often, and Christians fall for it so often. It's not constructive. It does no one any good. It drains you, and it's not helping them. And that goes back to keeping control of the conversation. Keep control of where you're headed. You will especially run into this when you're talking about alleged discrepancies in the Bible. Because someone will say, well, this is a contradiction. And so then you answer it. And they're like, well, this is a contradiction. And that's when you say, no, stop. Before we move on, I want you to tell me, is the answer I gave you satisfactory? I want us to make sure we're on the same page before we change subjects. So that's how you kind of react to this. And if the person doesn't want to, that's all you can do. But you're not going to get anything constructive done if you keep chasing the red herrings they're throwing out. So keep in mind, watch for those things. If someone abruptly changes the subject, that means you've struck a nerve. And that means that you're getting somewhere, because they can't answer it. If they could answer it, they would. So they're trying to change the subject so they don't have to face it anymore. So stay in control. Keep the conversation where it's supposed to be.
So, I saw that on Facebook just today where someone was talking about homosexuality, and someone was like, well, shellfish and stuff. So at that point, you don't go ahead and take the opportunity to explain the difference in the old law and the new law, you take them right back to homosexuality, or do you have to back up and start there? I mean, I feel like most people throw it out there just because they don't really want to talk about homosexuality anyway.
Yeah, I guess I'd have to look at it to really,
So it just depends
understand.
on the circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, but you can kind of tell if you can tell that it's starting to veer off what you were originally trying to talk about, like if you were talking about a specific Bible verse about homosexuality with somebody, and you demonstrate that what it says, then they say, well, a different example. What you say is, well, first of all, is this convincing? Do you concede this point? We can move on as long as we get to a conclusion on the one we're currently on. We need to do it justice. So yeah, probably from what you've said, but I would have to see it to have a firm conclusion on that. Okay, I went back too far. Any thoughts, any questions? That's all that I have presentation-wise tonight. Okay. I hope you stuck with me. We're going to get into the interesting topics next week, but I really wanted to lay groundwork these first 2 weeks and get a good mindset, a good framework for what we're going to be talking about. And hopefully you can see some of these things pop up later on and appreciate them and know what's going on. Questions for next week? First question. Read Deuteronomy 30, 15 through 19. And rewrite Moses' statement to Israel as a logical argument. On the handout, I put a hint. Remember, premise, conclusion. So look for the statements and then look for his therefore or his in conclusion, whatever he's saying. You can kind of build it from the bottom up if you have to, because I think the last verse is the one that has his conclusion. But basically the idea is just, use the logical thinking we talked about and put the verse into your own words. Second question, what logical fallacy does Jesus refer to in Matthew 11:19? We talked about 3, so it's going to be one of those 3. So just see if you can spot the fallacy and what's going on, what he's talking about. And third question, read Matthew 7:3, Mark 4:21, and Luke 5:23. Now, what do we see about Jesus' approach in teaching in these verses? What do they have in common? What's the common thread? And why would he take this approach? Okay, so that's all that I have. I got some books if you guys want to look at some, like some people did last week. This is the book I looked at and read for logic about all the stuff I showed tonight. I will warn you, it is dry. It is a textbook. It's really good though, so if you're interested in it, this would be a good place to start because it's actually written for Christians specifically. It has Bible-based examples for things that we talk about tonight. I would highly recommend this one if you want. Love your God with all your mind. Now, most of these books are not written by members of the church, so you'll have to take some things with a grain of salt, but a lot of good thinking here. And then these two are especially good for dealing with the topics we're going to be hitting in the next couple weeks. They spend a lot of time developing those topics. All right, sorry for holding you over. Thank you.